All right, greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Monday, August 4th, 2025, and on Mondays we talk about math and statistics. We're putting that today in the context of our study of cruelty this week. And we don't have a lot of good statistics in terms of trying to assess the general population in that regard. We know that, for example, in terms of psychopathology, the numbers or the percentages of psychopaths that exist in the population is less than 1%, thankfully, but not zero. But we don't really have good, rigorous national studies of people's levels of cruelty. What we do have is a lot of other research, though, that looks at human behavior in a variety of different contexts. So I'm not going to present any national statistics, but I'll come back to the issue of stats at the very end. But instead, what we have are, as I say, interesting research studies, including perhaps one of the most famous. Back in 1971, the Philip Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment. I suspect many of you should know about that. Certainly, if you went to college, you might have encountered that, and maybe just in general public knowledge. People these days are increasingly familiar with these sorts of things. But basically, what Zimbardo and his colleagues did was recruited 24 young men to participate in what they called a study of prison life. And the volunteer participants were then randomly assigned into one of two groups, 12 as either prisoners or guards, in a mock prison that had been constructed in the basement of the Stanford psychology department. So the young men were all normal by the various psychological testing measures. They were healthy, they had no criminal records, and they were paid for their participation. The idea was the young men were going to then replicate or simulate life in a prison. Okay, so they were going to play as prison guards, and they were going to play in the role of inmates. They were supposed to do this for a full 2 weeks. So the guards had uniforms. The prisoners went through a mock indoctrination as well into the prison setting, and so forth. So you can read about these details in any variety of different sources online. It's quite a famous study. But what happened that week in terms of the experiment, what it means for our understanding of behavior has been, the subject of scientific and public debate now for over half century. And the key finding was that after just a few days, the guards had begun to repress the prisoners, and their cruelty had just continued to escalate. And it got so bad that after 6 days, the study was prematurely terminated. And so the Stanford prison experiment, it's provided basically really compelling or striking evidence that normal, everyday people, well-adjusted young men in this case, could actually then come to harm and seriously harm innocent civilians, simply as a consequence of being randomly assigned to be a prison guard. So it's basically been a key reference point in discussions about tyranny and repression and cruelty. But it's also been presented to government officials and in court cases to help people understand the conditions and the situations that are conducive to things like prison riots and the abuse of detainees, for example, in the Iraq War, that sort of thing. And on top of this, it's provided all kinds of cultural materials. There's an influential website that's been useful in terms of providing critiques of prison life. There's a best-selling book on evil by Zimbardo that came out in 2007, I believe. A variety of different popular films and other cultural works, all influenced by the Stanford prison experiment. And so, to some degree, then, it's obvious that people can get caught up in their roles. And once they get into those roles, they start to obediently follow the cultural scripts that are demanded of them. And even to the point where they might act in cruel ways under social pressures, at least the pressures that are associated with those roles or with their colleagues around them who are putting pressure. Okay? But of course, not everyone's going to respond in the same way. Not everyone's going to behave with equal enthusiasm or equal cruelty. So yes, to some degree, there's a concern, there's a risk involved. But think about any, basic social context where you've got authority figures. Think of the police, think of school principals, even parents are the key authority figures in the household. And so the thing is most people, by definition, will fall within the normal range of behavioral expectations in terms of the behavioral patterns and so on. So what does that mean? It means that the average or typical response, whatever you're measuring, you're going to find, generally speaking, that the vast majority of people are going to fall within 2 standard deviations or within a certain range of normalcy. Where you start to get concerned when you're talking about maladaptive or antisocial behaviors are when people start falling outside of that normal distribution. And that's what I mean when we start talking about the psychopaths or sociopaths and what have you. Okay, so but much of our behavior, though, isn't just about our individual selves and how we respond and our motivations and our thought processes and so forth, but there's also the group context. And one of the most intriguing things about group settings is that they tend to amplify or accentuate our more extreme forms of behavior. So, for example, would you, if I ask you, or just by yourself, you're sitting around at night, would you consume 10 shots of liquor, of rum or whiskey, whatever, in less than a minute? Shotgun, one after another. No, neither would I. But would you do it on a dare? Or if you were pledging for a fraternity or a sorority? Maybe not. But one of my sons did exactly that. That is, and I saw the video evidence of him taking the 10 shots one after another. Basically, a minute. And by the way, that was incredibly stupid and dangerous, as he acknowledged himself. Never to repeat that particular little experiment, shall we say. But that's the effect that groups can have on our behavior. Imagine your worst enemy. Can you imagine, and the person, or maybe there's somebody you just hate out there, you despise. Maybe it's a politician, whatever. Can you imagine taking a gun and then shooting that person that you really, really dislike or even hate? Can you imagine just going up and killing them? Me neither. I can't do that. That's not in me, I don't think. But imagine being in a war zone. That's different, right? And then having to shoot at your enemies on the other side. Now you're being asked to kill people. But it's socially condoned, right? Could you do that? Probably. But it's interesting because the research shows that even there, it's hard, at least initially, for people to shoot at living, breathing targets. They'll tend to shoot deliberately high and miss on purpose, if you will, even in actual warfare situations. So it's, of course, much easier than to just drop bombs from 30,000 feet or to send out drones where you don't have to actually see the consequences of your actions. And finally, what have we learned recently about the Stanford prison experiment? Well, what we've learned, among other things, is that Zimbardo and his colleagues didn't tell the whole story. That is, the leadership that we're exposed to can also have an important effect as well on our behavior. Leaders can encourage conformity to whatever the dominant group norms are. They can reinforce our identities as the good soldier, as the top-notch prison guard, right? You're pulling your weight, you're doing your part, whatever it is that we might be doing. And so beyond the laboratory, it's also quite clear that this type of identity leadership is common in situations that involve toxic behavior, cruelty, and brutality, and especially in their most extreme forms. A recurrent observation is that leaders work quite hard not only to create a common identity with would-be perpetrators, but to convince them that cruelty to outgroups is necessary. Whether that outgroup, whether it's cruelty towards Muslims, towards migrants, towards dissidents, towards non-English speakers, whatever the case may be. But the point is that the leadership can convince people then that it's necessary for the protection and the advancement of the in-group's interests. Keep Serbia strong, make America great, keep Turkey safe, etc. But the best of the examples that I can think of in terms of these dynamics of human cruelty and how leadership encourages or can encourage such cruelty comes from Himmler's infamous Poznan speech, dated October 6, 1943. And there he rallied the SS officers to persevere with the challenges of exterminating the Jews in occupied Poland. The substance of his speech is exemplified in the following passage, which I'll read just very quickly. It is one of those things that is easily said. The Jewish people is being exterminated. Every party member will tell you. But none of them has seen it happen. No one has had to go through with it. Most of you men know what it's like to see 100 corpses lying side by side, or 500, or 1,000. To have stood fast through all of this and, at the same time, to have remained a decent person has made us hard. This is an unwritten and never to be written page of glory in our history. All in all, however, we can say that we've carried out this most difficult of tasks in a spirit of love for our people. End quote. Again, I suspect for most of us, if not all of us, it's very difficult to imagine being in the SS or overseeing concentration camps and the death and the murder of hundreds, thousands of Jews and others. But these things happen. And so much more. And even in recent history, there have been a multitude of different genocides and what one of my colleagues refers to as proto-genocides in different parts of the world. Or even just the celebratory reactions of Israeli soldiers killing Palestinians, and to some degree vice versa. How do people celebrate cruelty towards others, killing of others, and so on? But one way to do that, or one of the crucial aspects, is if you can frame cruelty as being essential to the achievement of your group's noble collective goals, whatever those might be. And you can then argue that it's a critical strategy then for mobilizing people and getting them to hate, getting them to act in the cruelest of fashions towards those that stand in their way, towards those who have been defined as subhuman or evil or the problem. And so it seems that framing cruelty as essential to achieving goals is one of the most important aspects to get people to go along with you, to do the most horrific things that, again, at the individual level, we'd almost certainly never even consider. So I don't have the exact numbers, but suffice it to say that the forces that are at play here, and especially at the group and the national levels, are incredibly compelling and pushing people increasingly, I would argue, in recent years to respond to the calls of hate and harm of others, including official hate crime statistics, for example. Those we see skyrocketing. And we've seen increased levels of violence and cruelty in a number of different theaters, in a number of different spheres. And then, of course, once it becomes commonplace or the norm, you can expect greater percentages, greater proportions of people to start clustering around the new normal, right? That moving of the Overton window, so that what was once unthinkable now becomes increasingly commonplace, increasingly acceptable. Yeah, that's just what we do here, okay? And this is kind of the natural contagion that we see occurring in so many group settings. So I'm working personally, professionally, on coming up with some high-quality statistics on human cruelty. And that's my next book, my next major project. But it's an incredibly difficult thing to do scientifically, but not impossible. So stay tuned. All right, in the meantime, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. And I hope to see you tomorrow. Take care.